Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome to an allergy and acne-ridden episode of my top 5. The pollen is outside and just, it's full-blown. It's awful. I couldn't breathe the past couple of days to even do this video, so sorry for this one being late. And then now my skin thinks I'm 14 or something because of this crap, but whatever. I want to stumble my way through this video. I'll drag myself to the finish line if I have to, because we're talking about my top 5 favorite hard rock and heavy metal bass guitarists. And this is a kind of a different spin on like my previous video on my favorite heavy metal guitar players, where, you know, everything from tone, technique, the overall stage presence of some of my favorite guitar players have an influence on me in practically every category of guitar playing, you know, mixing, recording, the overall sound. But for bass players, because I don't consider myself a real bass player. I mean, I can kind of play bass, but it doesn't feel like an extension of the rest of my body like a guitar does. I play it mainly as a recording instrument and to ride on and make my own music. And, you know, I'll screw around every now and then with one. But the way that bass players have influenced me has really been on tone, how to write for bass guitar, and how, you know, you should approach it as an instrument rather than just, you know, hitting a note every time the kick drum hits like you see in a lot of genres. So with that, I suppose I'll go in the order that I was introduced to these guitarists like last time, starting with Robert Trujillo, who is formerly of Ozzy Osbourne, Black Label Society, suicidal tendencies as well, and of course is now the current Metallica bass guitarist. Actually has been the longest Metallica bass guitarist, which is kind of weird thought. But I was introduced to Robert's playing the first time I watched Ozzy live at the Budokan. I think it was a 2002 DVD, and I was kind of playing guitar at the time. I just started, but, you know, I could barely name like, you know, half a dozen guitar players, let alone being familiar with bass and stuff. But my introduction to bass guitar and what I was familiar with at that time, having played in, you know, school functions and having family that listened to classic rock and country mostly, it was a write-off instrument for me. It was like, that is the most boring shit anyone could ever want to play. Like, that's got to be an instrument for people that just are crap at everything else. And then I saw Robert Trujillo and I was like, holy shit, that's what a bass guitar player should do. And it introduced me to whole new worlds in terms of what was possible with the instrument for playing, for the sound, the aggressiveness. And because of all that, he still remains among my favorite bass players ever. That show recording must have been the first time I'd ever heard that kind of grinding bass sound with the high frequency distortion on top of the low end thump, and something that, you know, so many people continue to emulate. Not to say that he's the one that started that, it's been going on forever, but I certainly think he has his own flavor of that overall sound, and to be able to do it finger picking and to be able to play that fast, he's just a monster of a bass player. And I honestly really think his talents are kind of squandered in Metallica, though obviously when I learned he was in Metallica, I was you know, happy that someone could finally play Cliff Burton's parts live. And he's always sounded great on, you know, all their recordings, especially their past few studio albums. So for his tone, for his playing style, for his monstrous stage presence, and for introducing me to bass as a legitimate instrument with a high ceiling for those that can actually play that way, I will always keep Robert among my top picks for favorite bass guitarists of all time. My next pick also followed my early Ozzy Osbourne obsession as a young guitar player. And this was actually the first bass player to help make Ozzy famous, and that is, of course, the infamous Geezer Butler of Black Sabbath. I'd heard him probably first on the radio, and like all the other great bass players I'll talk about here and those that I don't, you know, I'd heard it, but I didn't really appreciate what was going on. But, you know, as I was following Ozzy's work and with, you know, being partially obsessed with Tony Iommi, I really started zoning in on what Geezer was doing, and undoubtedly it was the perfect trifecta between, you know, Tony Iommi and Bill Ward and Geezer Butler, where they all just meshed perfectly to make the sound. No two of them could do what the other was doing without their help. And Geezer really laid down this baseline force of nature that I mean, it's still kind of unparalleled, if, you know, especially within the context of what they were doing in the 70s and early 80s. Geezer's playing really taught me a lot of valuable lessons in terms of writing for bass especially, but, you know, in terms of what you should play in context, when you should, and equally importantly, when you shouldn't play. And, you know, that was really accentuated by the fact that they're a three-piece. So, you know, if Iommi soloing, then the only other person that's laying down a pitch was Geezer Butler. And, you know, a lot of music, they can take the easy way out and just thump, 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 follow the kick drum, change the you know, chord, change the key when they need to, but not Geezer. He played constantly, but it was, you know, tasteful. It's all about the dynamics for him, whether it's softly plucking the A string or slamming a split octave or even a power chord, ultimately making the song interesting to listen to, even if there's nothing else playing, and different ways to harmonize with the guitar or follow the drums more, or kind of be a liaison between the two to overall fill out a mix. And that's sort of my litmus test for writing bass passages myself is, you know, does it groove like Geezer? Does it add something to the song? Or does it detract from it? And if so, you need to go back to the drawing board. But you can certainly do different things. You can follow a guitar, but still be interesting, more so than just adding a lower octave to every power chord. You can, you know, kind of do a solo over a drum fill. You can do all these different things that I didn't really appreciate until I listened to early Sabbath and even on through the Heaven and Hell years and all that stuff. So yeah, Geezer, even though he may not be like the technical virtuoso that you'll see in so many other players, he's definitely one of the most iconic and, you know, legendary heavy metal bassists ever, because everyone follows what he did. In those same formative years, as I was searching for different guitar tones and playing styles, I came across, like most people, the new wave of British heavy metal era, and was subsequently introduced to Motorhead, and of course their frontman and bass guitar player, Lemmy Kilmister. I mean, the band blew my mind in general when I first heard them. It's like, they're doing this stuff in the late 70s and early 80s. I mean, it's thrash metal before thrash metal. It's kind of punk rock. It's kind of everything. And it's glorious. And no small part of that because of the playing and tone of Lemmy's bass guitar. That was certainly another definitive moment for me where I said, holy shit, you can do that with a bass guitar. Because it kind of put it into context of what I was hearing with some more contemporary genres, where you'd hear a guitar tone and it sounded okay, you know, it sounded good on its own, but then when the full mix came in, you're like, where is that other sound coming from? And a lot of times it was the bass. Obviously, like I said, Robert kind of has his own grindy top end thing going on, but not nearly to the extent of what you hear with, you know, death metal or more contemporary genres. And I was like, oh, so that's how bands like Meshuggah are getting that gnarly guitar tone, because half of it ain't even guitar, it's bass. It's a distorted bass, and Lemmy's is definitely towards the top of being a distorted bass. And of course those tones were partly due to the fact that he ran his bass through a lot of gear that resembles guitar gear from that time. I mean, his bass amps and stuff were designed for bass guitars, but they definitely shared the same DNA with a lot of the Marshall Plexis and 2203s, to the point that the distortion character kind of resembles those amps. It sits in the mix like a bass amp should, but running it through stuff like 4x12 cabs, mixing that with 2 or 1x15s, has a very unique sonic character that is undeniably Lemmy. I mean, when you hear it, it's him. Obviously, none of that would matter if he didn't play the way he did, because he hit the hell out of those bass strings. Used a lot of things that, you know, normally would be reserved for guitar players, like power chords, a lot of single note passages as well, but it was another valuable lesson in context, where it's like, if you're going to sound that aggressive with all the other instruments, then don't be afraid to, you know, let it rip on bass guitar as well. And Lemmy did all of this while, of course, singing lead vocals, and pretty much did it all the way up until he died. So if that doesn't deserve some respect, I don't know what does. Next is a golden example of one of those bassists that I'd heard on the radio quite a bit, but I never really appreciated. It didn't really click. And hell, I didn't even really like their music all that much. But, you know, as my palette grew and as I came to appreciate kind of what was going on with other bass guitarists, this one hit me hard, and that is Geddy Lee of Rush. He still is kind of my benchmark for what a progressive bass should sound like, and is especially a good sanity check when I'm writing bass. He introduced me to so much in terms of like polyrhythms, syncopation, different melodic lines that you can, fit into the context of a bass guitar and still sound like a bass, and not really overstep your boundaries, kind of let the guitar doing what they're doing. You can still kind of follow the drums, but have this just monolithic sound. And obviously he's talented as hell, so I can never replicate what he does. But Geddy's playing and my introduction to Rush in general was another one of those mind-blowing experiences where it's like, I can't believe you can do that on that instrument. And better yet, if you can do that, what the hell is everyone else doing? They're asleep at the wheel by comparison. And of course, he's a front man, can sing at the same time, doing all this ridiculous stuff, can switch between that and keyboard, so just makes you sick with talent. But he really is still my go-to when it comes to a perfect example of what you should strive for in especially progressive genres, of not being in the background, but staying out of the way for other instruments to make, kind of do what they're doing, but not making it boring, but also not overly technical to where, someone who isn't a musician can't follow it. Because you can hear melodic lines, you can hear the syncopation, how, all the rhythms line up, and it's just a perfect example of what a good bass player should be. Of course, extraordinary bass player in this example. This final pick was really difficult because at this point the floodgates were fully opened and I was exposed to so much great music, and I have so many hard rock and heavy metal bassists whose work I love and I still respect today. I can make this video like 10 hours long just gushing about it, but I think the next one that really made me say, yeah, I want to do that, was Behemoth's Tomasz Obrowalewski, aka Orion. He sort of epitomizes that sphere of bass guitar tones and playing, where it's like that extended scale 4 or 5 string, extremely metal looking ESP bass guitar through a set of EMGs, through maybe an active preamp, and into that dirty dark glass sound. I think for stage sound he uses another like solid state stack, but pretty much his recorded over front of house sound is mostly like a solid state dark glass pedal, and it just sounds mean as hell. It's that perfect thump, the dirty top end that kind of blends with the guitars better, makes it stick out in the mix. It's actually audible, but knows its job as a kind of that death metal bass sound. So he does all that, of course, while being backup vocalist, and he's one of the most aggressive vocal sounds in the industry, period. I freaking love his growl. Of course, he's a front man for his own band as well, but I think Behemoth really isn't Behemoth without Orion. All the guys do a great job. Nurgle obviously is a hell of a front man, but it wouldn't be the same without either his bass influence or especially his vocals. But yeah, I really, really like Orion's work, especially his own stuff as well. So when I'm dialing in those contemporary bass tones with the top end distortion, that's really what comes to mind. That's the sound I think of. That's the player I think of. And for that, he will definitely remain among my top picks, probably forever. I can't do one of these videos without at least a small honorable mention section. So for another extremely talented death metal bass player, Alex Webster of Cannibal Corpse, good Lord, that guy's ridiculous. And he's a great example of someone who sounds aggressive while using a relatively pristine, clean tone. I mean, there's some string slapping and stuff going on, but for the most part, it's just like a straight up bass DI through a bass amp sound. It's really nothing special, but he is so insane with, got the 3-finger gallop, you got the multiple string run thing, so much better at music theory than I could ever hope to be. Absolutely incredible bass player. Another example of so talented they make you sick would be Primus's Les Claypool, and I actually got introduced to the band through South Park of all places, as they do the theme song and have showed up a time or two, but turned into a pretty good relationship, I think. And he's one of those guys, like, he just makes a mockery out of everyone that attempts to play the instrument. You're not even playing bass at that point. You're just making it your pitch. And just so many cool sounds. I love the music. I really like what they're able to do, make it quirky, but somehow still musical and listenable to me. So, I mean, just watch what he can do. It's hours worth of entertainment in that alone. And lastly, I've got to give a shout out to Sleep's Al Cisneros. He's one of those examples of make every note count, go back to basics. Taught me a lot about what you can do with bass distortion, playing high up on the neck, different note selections, different grooves for that kind of doom sludge sound. And he's another one of those bass players that I would put in the camp of Geezer Butler. It's like, yeah, you can do all kinds of movement, you can make it interesting, but even if you're going to play 4 or 5 notes, you can make it sound cool. You can make it dynamic and worth listening to and not bore the audience to death. And he's certainly a masterful example of both tone and playing in his field. So that will do it for today's top 5. Any suggestions, questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below, and we will see you next time. Bye.